rough waters.
I think it was rough because we stayed docked idle for about 2 nights, and then today, this is a trip that's supposed to take 6 or 7 hours. Took us about 9.5 hours. High seas, the situation was pretty bad. High waves and what have you.
Also perhaps a watershed moment for many governments around the world who were afraid to threaten Colonel Gaddafi's regime while their civilians were still on the ground. Now, of course, the conversation can turn to potential military intervention.
Well, the UN Security Council, is set to meet again to discuss potential action against Libya. For more on the options that are on the table right now, let's cross over to Daljit Dhaliwal in our Washington Broadcast Center. Daljit.
Sammy, thanks very much. Well, there's going to be a special session of the Security Council on Saturday to try to pass the draft resolution that was produced on Friday. Meanwhile, the White House is imposing its own sanctions, and Scott Heidler has more on that from the United Nations.
The Libyan mission arriving to brief the UN Security Council Friday, calling for swift action to curb the violence in their country. An emotional plea from Libya's ambassador, the latest high-profile diplomat to abandon the Gaddafi government.
Please, United Nations, save Libya. No to bloodshed, no to killing of innocents. We want a decisive, a rapid and a courageous resolution from you.
And it looks like they will be getting something from the Security Council. A draft resolution put together by the UK and France is expected to pass on Saturday. The resolution calls for an arms embargo both into and out of Libya, plus a travel ban and asset freeze for Gaddafi and his inner circle. It also seeks to refer the situation in Libya to the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. Is it enough?
Mr. Secretary General, you said that this is an urgent time. Loss of time is loss of life. And the draft resolution details embargoes, sanctions, freezing accounts. Is that enough to stop the violence now? As you said, it's an urgent time. Is that enough to stop it now? Should there be military intervention?
I have urged the Security Council to take a wide range of options. I understand that the Security Council is very seriously considering all possible options, but that is up to the member states of the Security Council to determine what course of action should be taken at this time.
In Washington, too, talk turned to accountability on Friday. For days, the U.S. had said its highest priority was ensuring the safety of its citizens in Libya. And no sooner had the U.S. chartered ferry from Tripoli docked in Malta with more than 150 Americans on board than the White House came out with its own action plan.
We have decided to move forward with unilateral sanctions, which we are in the process of finalizing. Coordinated sanctions with our European allies and multilateral efforts to hold the Libyan government accountable through the United Nations.
For its part, the United Nations won't say what additional options are on the table for dealing with Gaddafi.
I think it's too early to say. We are basically focusing on this resolution right now, and we will continue to follow the situation.
Well, more details have emerged about those White House measures against Libya, and Scott Heidler joins us now live from the United Nations. So more details, Scott, filtering through from the United States. Bring us up to speed. What have they decided?
Yeah, well, there was an executive order issued by President Obama, and the wording of this is quite interesting because for this order to be put forth, and it's the unilateral sanctions on Libya by the United States. And to do this order, they have to actually declare, the president actually has to declare a national emergency, and that what's going on in Libya, and I'm reading from the document, constituting an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. Now, that is strong wording, definitely, but it's also procedural to actually issue one of these orders. And in it puts sanctions against any Libyan-held assets in the United States. It put a list of 5 Libyan nationals on a travel ban list. So it's unilateral sanctions that are fairly similar to what we're seeing in the draft resolution that the Security Council will most likely pass on Saturday. So this is an extraordinary step that now the United States also has their sanctions, as well as these sanctions we're probably going to see come out from the Security Council on Saturday.
And Scott, just a very quick point about the language. I mean, I know you're saying that it's routine, but it does sound quite strong. Why do they have to invoke the language in this particular way?
Because for this order to actually go through and to put these sanctions through, they have to actually indicate that it is a national security issue, that it's a national emergency with serious security issues for the United States. So that's so they can actually put this order into effect and put these sanctions, these unilateral sanctions on Libya. So that's why it's just needed to go that extra step. And we also know that the United States, both the White House and obviously the mission here to the United Nations, have also been working very closely with the Security Council and the sanctions that are part of the resolution, the Chapter 7 resolution that we're going to see tabled tomorrow in a special session of the Security Council.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about that draft resolution. I'm kind of curious. I mean, in the international community's rush, you know, obviously that's very important to try to get something done and to try to speak with a unified voice. I mean, do people think that this is going to stop the violence today, in a couple of days' time, next week or the week after?
Well, that's a very similar question I addressed to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon after he briefed the Security Council earlier on Friday. And he kind of dodged it and said that, you know, all options are on the table and it's up to the members of the Security Council what options those are. But in this draft resolution, it doesn't call for military action. It doesn't call for no-fly zone. But what might happen next? Is there going to be another resolution? Are we going to see resolutions that deal specifically with military action and tougher measures to clamp down the violence in Libya? That might be down the line. But this first resolution was had to be pushed through. We were hearing from members on the sidelines of the Security Council meetings today and previous days that they wanted to get something through. They had a press statement that came through on Tuesday, not really that much, but showing their power that the Security Council has. So they really wanted to push something through. This is what they came up with. So maybe down the line they'll float some other draft resolutions that might have bigger teeth. But right now, as the Security Council president was telling us earlier as well, that, you know, let's take this one step at a time. What we have right now is this resolution. Let's get it passed and then look at the next step.
All right, Scott, many thanks. Scott Heidler live for us at the United Nations in New York. Now, John Alterman is director of the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I asked him if the measures in the UN's draft resolution would bring an immediate end to the bloodshed in Libya.
In power. I think one of the key audiences for everything that's happening is the people around Muammar Gaddafi, to affect their sense of what are the consequences if they stay with him, what are the possibilities if they leave him.
And it's a high-risk strategy, though, isn't it? I mean, because it doesn't stop the killing immediately. And if people wanted to defect, I mean, there have already been people who've defected. Right. So what makes the international community think that this is the right way to go and this is what's going to stop people from getting killed?
Well, if you wanted to have a military action, which is certainly a possibility, you'd need some sort of international sanction for military action. And that would take time to line up. And certainly the way the Security Council works, you know, that takes some number of days. I think the problem that we're having partly is that the way the international community works is not the way the news community works. And there is a sense that this is changing hour by hour. We're getting tweets, we're getting videos, we're getting all sorts of things, incredible images coming out of Libya. But we don't have the apparatus to move that quickly. Right.
Understood. But so do you think then that perhaps when the United States talks about taking some kind of unilateral action of its own, that this may involve some kind of military intervention, it may involve a no-fly zone? And what do you think are the complications that would surround something like that?
I don't think you're about to have a no-fly zone. I don't think you're going to have a no-drive zone.
They haven't ruled it out, though, have they?
They haven't ruled it out. But one of the challenges setting up a no-fly zone, right, is you have to be willing to shoot somebody down if they keep flying. And then you're in a war situation. And do you really want to be in that war situation? How do you get out of that war? How long does the war go? I think the desire right now is create as much international unity as you can create. Try to move forward on that path. Try to create the circumstances by which you narrow the circle of people who are tied to the same fate as Muammar Gaddafi.
Right, but don't you think that it is a high-risk strategy? What happens if it doesn't work? Then what does the international community do?
Well, what, I mean, I'm not sure if what you're suggesting is the U.S. should invade Libya. I mean,
no, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm just wondering if this strategy doesn't work, is there a plan B? And what are the other options?
No, there's certainly a quick escalation. I think what's important is this is a quick escalation. We're not talking about escalation over 3 months. And we are talking about an escalation over days and weeks toward more direct action. But I think the important thing is that all of these international efforts under international law takes some period of time. If we're going to move military assets, moving military assets takes time. None of those things can be done instantly. I think we are creating a menu of options with the hope that this moves relatively quickly, that people around Muammar Gaddafi say there is no hope in this, there is another way out, and then we get out of really the horrific killing which has been going on and seems to be escalating.
We hope that we get out of it.
Yeah.
We don't know whether it's going to work, but that's certainly the strategy these are the ideas that are being floated at the moment. I mean, we don't know if they're going to work.
We never know if anything's going to work until you do it.
All right, Mr. Alterman, thanks very much. Venezuela's foreign minister has accused the United States of inciting the uprising in Libya in order to seize the country's oil. The foreign minister, Nicolas Maduro, claims that Washington and its allies are provoking a movement aimed at ending Gaddafi's 42 years in power.
They are creating conditions to justify an invasion of Libya, and the main goal of this invasion of Libya is the same goal that George Bush had. It's the oil. Take the oil from Libya, dismember Libya in 20 pieces, and leave the OPEC without one of its main pillars.
Well, the protests in Libya come after the uprising in Egypt that forced Hosni Mubarak from power 2 weeks ago. But the demonstrations there are continuing. And for more on that part of the story, let's cross back to Sami now in Doha. Sami?
Continuing they are, AlJazeera. In the last few hours, scuffles broke out at those demonstrations in Tahrir or Liberation Square. Tensions boiled over between soldiers and protesters, but the situation is now calm. Demonstrators have been calling for speedier political reforms. They're concerned the military simply isn't moving fast enough to repeal emergency laws. Well, in the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, there's been a big show of support for the president, but nationwide, tens of thousands of people marched against the long-running rule of Ali Abdullah Saleh. He's ordered the formation of a committee to open talks with protesters who are demanding he steps down. And in Jordan, as on Fridays, for the past 2 months, protesters demanded political and economic reform. There was a strong police presence in the capital, Amman, as calls were made to limit the powers of King Abdullah. The leader of Jordan's largest opposition group, Hamza Mansour, says people's patience is running out because of the government's slow moves towards reform. Anti-monarchy protests too in Bahrain, where there have been demands for the king and his government to step down. Tens of thousands of protesters gathered in